ranked every single type in Pokemon. Again, I made this same video 3 years ago, but things have changed enough to warrant a redo. Since then, I've either gotten smarter, gotten dumber, or maybe just a lot of things have changed. Many types got better in Scarlet and Violet. Bug, unfortunately, was not one of them. Bug was the worst type in Sword and Shield, and it's the worst type in Scarlet and Violet. Here's why. Bug can only hit 3 types for super effective damage, and they're all middle tier types: Psychic, Grass, and Dark. To make things worse, a Bug is resisted by 7 types, the most of any type in the game. Defensively, a Bug is a little bit better. It has 3 weaknesses and 3 resistances. It's one of only 3 types in the entire game that resist ground, which is a pretty big deal. Sadly, this isn't enough to save it from dead last on our list. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to today's sponsor, Guardian Tales for the Nintendo Switch. Guardian Tales is a free adventure RPG with a pixel art style reminiscent of your favorite classic JRPGs. This game is tons of fun and filled with homages to dozens of beloved video games, anime, movies, TV, and pop culture in general. There's so many support characters and weapons to choose from. Each weapon has its own use, making combat more strategic and fun. Better yet, starting December 27th and going through January 10th, you can get 10 free summons to use in battle every day with a max of 50 summons overall. Oh, and did I mention, the game itself is free. It's wild because there's so much to do. You can even get a load of side content too: PvP, guilds, an entire floating island to customize however you'd like. As for the main story, you'll have dungeons to explore, sophisticated puzzles to solve, and even pathways that lead to treasures and hidden story. The world map features various themes such as fantasy, snowy mountain, desert, academy, and, just in time for the holidays, Christmas. But no matter where you are, the unique story and gameplay is sure to keep you hooked. Click the link in my description below to get your journey started today. Thanks again to Guardian Tales for sponsoring the video. Here's where the changes from my last list start. Previously, I've said a couple times that Ice is the second worst type in the game. In Scarlet and Violet, that slot instead goes to Normal. Normal is weird. Actually, ironically, Normal is an abnormal type compared to most of the other types. It has no resistances, only 1 weakness, 1 immunity, 2 types that resist it, and 1 type that's immune to it. Previously, I ranked Normal a fair bit higher, but I think I might have been wrong in doing so. Many Normal type Pokemon are good, yes, but it's because they tend to have higher stats and better move pools than other Pokemon to compensate for the fact that their type sucks. The Normal type in most cases doesn't do anything for your Pokemon. Having resistances is a pretty big deal in competitive Pokemon, as is hitting your opponents for super effective damage. Normal can be okay on a dual type Pokemon to give you that nice immunity to Ghost, but other than that, it's really underwhelming. Number 16 goes to Poison. I gotta be honest, I'm personally just a little bit poison pilled. I personally think it's a bit better than it looks, but the fair and somewhat objective ranking for it is right here on this list. Poison does a couple of things well. It only has 2 weaknesses, plus it gets 5 resistances, one of which is to Fairy, which is a notoriously difficult type to switch into. Offensively, Poison has some problems. It can hit Grass and Fairy type Pokemon for super effective damage, and hitting Fairy is a really big deal. But it's resisted by Poison, Ground, Rock, and Ghost, and Steel types are immune to Poison type attacks. Okay, I have to address the elephant in the room. Part of the reason my list is so different this time around is because I made it specifically for Scarlet and Violet. Scarlet and Violet's main mechanic is terastallization. Just like how flying types were better in Sword and Shield because of how strong Max Airstream was, each type in Scarlet and Violet will use terastallization to varying degrees of success. This video isn't about the best Terra types. I've actually already made that video. But basically, how good each Terra type is also affects how good each individual type is. To put it simply, pretend we lived in a world where like every Pokemon wanted to use Terra Normal, Ghost type Pokemon would be ranked lower. And the world that we do live in is that Steel is, without a doubt, by far the best Terra type. As such, anything that matches up positively against Steel gets bonus points for our list, and anything that struggles against it gets knocked down. With that in mind, I could not put Poison higher than the bottom 3 because, again, Steel types are immune to it. Number 15 goes to Rock. Rock isn't a bad type, but it's certainly not a good one. Rock is weak to grass, ground, water, fighting, and steel, all of which are fairly common. It resists normal flying, fire, and poison, but only fire and maybe flying are somewhat common. Offensively, Rock does a bit better, hitting fire, flying, bug, and ice for super effective damage, and only resisted by steel, fighting, and ground. Now, Rock's relationships with the other types is nothing to write home about, but it does have one unique attribute that makes it better than the types below it. The Sandstorm weather effect damages all Pokemon at the end of each turn for 1/16 of their total health, except if they're Rock, Ground, or Steel type. Importantly, it also gives all Rock type Pokemon a 50% boost to their special defense stat. This is a huge benefit for Rock types and helps it overcome at least some of its shortcomings, earning it a better spot than it would otherwise have. Number 14 is Psychic. Last time I made this video, I put Psychic in the A tier. I would like to apologize. I am now a certified Psychic type hater, and I have no idea how I could have ranked it so high. Anyway, let's talk about what Psychic does. It has 3 weaknesses and only 2 resistances. Offensively, it hits poison and fighting types for super effective damage and is resisted by steel and psychic types. Also, dark types are immune to it. What I finally realized is that Psychic is basically just glorified normal. You barely hit any Pokemon for super effective damage, and you only get 2 resistances. Many Psychic type Pokemon are good because of their stats or their move pool, or maybe they're a dual type who appreciate the extra coverage. The type itself, however, isn't doing you any favors, so I'm putting it far lower than last time. Number 13 is Flying. Just like Psychic, I did put this one in the A tier last time, but Sword and Shield had max airstream, so that wasn't just me being dumb. You might be surprised to see Flying this low, but let me explain. Flying is weak to Rock, Electric, and Ice, resists Grass, Bug, and Fighting, and is immune to Ground. The types Flying is weak to are more common than the ones it resists, but the immunity to Ground is really nice. Offensively, Flying kinda sucks. It only hits Bug, Grass, and Fighting for super effective damage, and Rock, Steel, and Electric all resist it. Frankly, this is just a bad offensive spread. The reason many Flying types have done so well over the years is that they're all Flying dual types who just use Flying as a free ground immunity. Zapdos, Gyarados, Charizard, Galarian Moltres, Salamence, Rayquaza, Landorus T, Thundurus. These are all Flying dual types. Flying is nice as a secondary type, but doesn't really hold up on its own. I know you've been waiting for it. Number 12 finally goes to Ice. It's definitely improved in Generation 9, but not enough to crack top 10. Previously, I ranked Ice as the second worst type in the game, but I'm going out on a limb and putting it much higher this time around. First, let's talk about its matchup spread. Defensively, it sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Ice only resists Ice, which must be some kind of sick joke created by Pikachu after a snow day forced him to stay home and actually play with his kids for once. On top of having only 1 resistance, Ice has 4 weaknesses to Fire, Fighting, Steel, and Rock. Offensively, Ice is much stronger, hitting Flying, Grass, Ground, and Dragon types for super effective damage and being resisted by Steel, Ice, Fire, and Water. Now, this matchup spread as a whole is bad. So why is Ice this high? There's 2 reasons. First, Ice is the type that benefits the most from Terastallization because Terastallization allows you to keep your offensive matchups while changing your defensive ones. Ice has terrible defensive relationships and pretty good offensive ones, so it's the perfect type to take advantage of Terastallization. The second reason is that Ice types finally received a buff in Generation 9 thanks to Snow replacing Hail. Now, instead of dealing a little bit of damage at the end of each turn like Sandstorm does, Snow instead makes all Ice-type Pokemon 50% physically bulkier. With these 2 changes, Generation 9 might finally see Ice types getting some play. Hey, really quick, before we continue with the rest of the list, I just wanted to take a second and ask you to please consider subscribing. We've upped our video output by about 8 times what it was for most of the last year, and in order to do this, we had to bring out a bunch of extra people, and so any support that you all can show the channel just helps me do bigger projects and more videos. We're getting really close to 1 million subscribers, which is frankly a milestone that I never thought that I would hit, and I really need your help to get there. So even if you think you're subscribed already, I'd appreciate you just taking a second to double check. Number 11 goes to Grass. My experience is that most people seem to think that Grass is a much worse type than it actually is. It's actually a really solid middle of the pack type. Here's why. Grass has 4 resistances and 5 weaknesses, but to be fair, 2 of those weaknesses are to Bug and Poison, 2 of the worst offensive types. The types that Grass does resist, Water, Ground, Electric, and Grass, are all pretty common, so it ends up feeling like grass resists a lot more types than it actually does. Offensively, grass only hits 3 types for super effective damage and is resisted by 7, which is tied for bug by the most types that resist it. To be fair, the 3 types that grass does hit are very valuable. Grass types also have a secondary benefit. They're immune to powder moves. Powder moves like Sleep Powder, Spore, and Rage Powder are all used a lot in competitive Pokemon. Being immune to them is one of the major benefits of using a grass type Pokemon. By the way, remember earlier when I talked about how good Terra Steel was? Well, we are so far 8 types into our list, and thus far, every single type we've talked about is resisted by Steel. Yeah. Let me know in the comments where you think it's gonna land on this list. Well, it's not number 10. That belongs to our first type that can actually hit Steel, Fighting. Fighting is a solid type, with resistances to Bug, Dark, and Rock, and weaknesses to Flying, Psychic, and Fairy. This is okay, but in my opinion, the offense is really where Fighting shines. Even though 5 types resist it and Ghost is immune, Fighting is able to hit 5 types for super effective damage, including the very hard to hit Normal, Dark, and Steel. I think Fighting is a great example of quality over quantity when it comes to type matchups. You could look at this matchup spread and think that Fighting looks a little unimpressive, but the devil's in the details. It's not always about the raw number. Number 9. Oh god, I have to do this. I know I have to, but I'm afraid. I'm so afraid. Okay. Number 9 is Dragon. I know, but hear me out. I used to think that Dragon was one of the best types in the game, but I changed. I see the truth. Dragon is nowhere near as good as I thought. It has 3 weaknesses to Dragon, Ice, and Fairy, and 4 resistances to Water, Fire, Electric, and Grass. Defensively, this is actually pretty good. Offensively, though, it is terrible. It can only hit other Dragon types for super effective damage, Steel resists it, and Fairies are immune. The reason why I used to think Dragon types were good is because there are so many good Dragon type Pokemon. But the thing is, these Dragons are so strong because Dragon is so bad that Game Freak can afford to give them a ton of stats. It's not their type that makes them strong, it's their stats. Also, yes, I know that thematically it makes the most sense for Dragon types to be the strongest. I'm not saying Dragon type Pokemon are bad by any means. I'm just saying it's not the type that's the reason that they find themselves at the top of so many people's best Pokemon lists. Number 8 is Dark. Dark, in my opinion, is kind of the perfected version of Normal and Psychic. It doesn't have a ton of interaction with the other types, but it has enough to still be valuable. Dark has 3 weaknesses, 2 resistances, and an immunity. This is okay defensively. You would like more resistances, but having an immunity is nice, and being weak to only 3 types, one of which isn't common at all, is also pretty good. Offensively, Dark can only hit 2 types for super effective damage and is resisted by 3. This is by no means great, but being resisted by only 3 types means you're able to hit the vast majority of the type chart for neutral damage. The reason that Dark is above Dragon has to do with the major benefit of the typing. Dark types are immune to all moves affected by Prankster, one of the best abilities in the game. Now, being immune to just one type of move from one specific ability might not sound very useful, but trust me, it is. All right, this is where we start getting into the cream of the crop. I kind of feel bad that I can't put this one higher, but number 7 goes to Electric. Electric is a good type. It's only weak to ground and has resistances to Electric, Steel, and Flying. Offensively, it only hits Flying and Water types for super effective damage and is resisted by Electric, Grass, and Dragon, with ground types being immune. It's worth noting that the ability to hit Water types for super effective damage is a pretty big deal. Water is only weak to Grass and Electric is by far the better of those 2. The main reason Electric is so good is because it only has 1 weakness while also having several resistances. It's a good standalone type, but as a dual type, it almost always only makes a Pokemon stronger. Number 6. So remember earlier when I said that I might be letting my own biases affect my rankings? Well, I was working on this list with my friends Marcus and Justin, and we were talking about what makes Fairy such a good type. I told them it was my number 1 type last generation because it has an immunity and only 2 weaknesses. Plus, it's great at hitting things for neutral damage. Hearing this, Justin thinks for a second and then blows my mind. Hey, isn't that basically the same thing as Ghost? I was like, oh. Yeah, so number 6 is Ghost, but maybe it should be higher. I don't know. Basically, most Ghost type Pokemon have pretty garbage stats, so we don't tend to think of the type as a whole as strong, but it is pretty similar to Fairy. Anyway, let's talk about what makes Ghost so good. Ghost only has 2 weaknesses. Ghost and Dark. While its only 2 resistances are to Bug and Poison, again 2 of the worst types in the game, Ghost is the only type in the game to have not 1 but 2 immunities to normal and fighting. Offensively, Ghost is only able to hit Ghost and Psychic types for super effective damage, but only 2 types can handle it defensively: Dark, which resists it, and Normal, which is immune. Put simply, the 2 immunities, limited weaknesses, and limited types that resist it make Ghost one of the best types in the game. Leading us into the top 5 is Ground. Ground is one of the best offensive types in the game, but let's start by talking about its defenses. It's weak to Water, Ice, and Grass, which isn't great, but it also isn't terrible. It could be worse. It resists Poison and Rock, and while Poison isn't very common, Rock type attacks are everywhere. Importantly, it's immune to Electric, which is really good because Electric type attacks feel like they are everywhere. But you already know that these defensive relationships aren't the reason why Ground is this high. Ground hits 5 types for super effective damage, including Electric, Steel, Poison, and Fire, all of which are relatively hard to hit. Better yet, only Bug, Grass, and Flying can take Ground type attacks, and Bug, as you know, isn't the best. Ground is so good that Grass and Flying types tend to perform better just because they match up well against it. There are also a ton of good Ground type attacks, so Ground type Pokemon never find themselves hurting for offensive choices. Number 4. Oh boy, this is gonna be ugly. Number 4 is Fairy. The type I formerly ranked at number 1, I am bumping down 3 places. Here's why. Fairy does a lot of things well. It only has 2 weaknesses, one of which is to Poison, and the other is to Steel, which also isn't that common of an offensive type. It also resists Bug, Fighting, and Dark, while being immune to Dragon. Offensively, it hits Fighting, Dark, and Dragon for super effective damage, while only Poison, Fire, and Steel resist it. This was, and is, an incredible spread against the rest of the types, and it didn't change in Generation 9. So why is Fairy so much lower? It all comes back to Terra Steel. More Pokemon than ever are going to be Steel type, which is bad enough on its own, but there's more. More Steel type Pokemon also means that Fire is better than ever, and both Steel and Fire resist Fairy. I just can't in good conscience put Fairy any higher, knowing full well that pretty much every Pokemon that's weak to Fairy will be running Terra Steel to counter it. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. We're into the top 3 now. Our third best type goes to Water, because it's incredibly well balanced. It's only weak to Grass and Electric, and it resists Fire, Water, Ice, and Steel. Offensively, it hits Ground, Rock, and Fire types for super effective damage, while Grass, Water, and Dragon types resist it. I was torn on whether Water should be number 2 or number 3 on this list, but I ultimately decided on number 3 because Water types got a huge nerf in Scarlet and Violet. The attack Scald used to be given to pretty much every Water type Pokemon, and it was a really good, reliable Water type attack that most Water type Pokemon use. In Scarlet and Violet, Scald is now only given to Volcanion, meaning many Water type Pokemon lost their best and most reliable Water type attack. Water is still a great type, but this nerf pushed it out of the top 2. Our runner-up slot goes to Fire. This is the best the Fire type has ever been, and although it's in part due to how good Terra Steel is, that's not the only reason. Fire is a surprisingly well-balanced type with way better defenses than you might expect. While it is weak to Water, Rock, and Ground, it also resists Fire, Grass, Bug, Steel, Ice, and Fairy. Offensively, Fire hits Grass, Bug, Steel, and Ice types for super effective damage, and is resisted by Fire, Water, Dragon, and Rock. Fire types also have the benefit of the harsh sunlight condition, powering up their Fire type attacks and weakening Water type attacks. In contrast to Water types who are now struggling to scrounge up good attacks, Fire types have an overabundance, with moves such as Flamethrower, Overheat, Fire Blast, and Heat Wave, to name a few. Fire's role as a well-rounded type with positive matchups against both Steel and Fairy earn it the number 2 slot on our list. Gee, I wonder what number 1 is. It could be anything. Just kidding. We've been talking about it all video. It is Steel. This type is truly absurd. Steel has 3 weaknesses: to Fire, Fighting, and Ground. How many resistances do you think it has? 6? 7? Surely not 8. Steel has 10 resistances and an immunity. Earlier, I mentioned how Terastallization allows you to keep your offensive benefits while giving up your defensive ones. Maybe now you can see why Steel is the clear winner out of all the Terra types. Offensively, Steel isn't amazing, but it also isn't bad. It hits Rock, Ice, and importantly, Fairy for super effective damage. It's resisted by Fire, Water, Electric, and of course, Steel. In my opinion, Steel as a type will define the game in Scarlet and Violet, and I'm really curious to see what counterplay, if any, players discover. Was there anything you disagreed with on this list? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.